You're listening to The Watchers, a show where two women from opposite ends of New Jersey watch
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we're doing. We're watching.
We're watching stuff.
I'm Andrea.
And I'm Jodie. And this week, what are we doing, Andrea?
So usually what we're doing is watching Yellowjackets.
Mm-hmm.
They're in their off season, which means we are in our off season, which means
we're still doing it.
We're just watching other stuff now.
Yeah. We're watching movies and TV that are part of our sort of like pop culture DNA, which is what would lead us to a show like Yellowjackets.
Exactly, yes.
Yes. So before we get started, I just want to mention a couple quick Yellowjackets things. One, the Celebrity Family Feud episode is coming out with the Yellowjackets cast, which is it's like the young cast versus the old cast. It's going to be very funny, I'm sure. Apparently it was a very competitive atmosphere, which is great.
Very good.
The other thing is they recently released the video of the Paley Fest panel that the cast did back in April. No big revelations there, just some delightful conversation as always. But a few lines that inspired me to revive Tawny's accent corner for this week, which I think, Andrea, you'll pop in here.
Absolutely. Here's the first one.
I'm only laughing because I know how scary Tawny can be.
I'm a pussycat. What are you talking about?
What are you talking about?
It is one word.
Yeah. What are you talking about?
She leans. I love when she really lets it.
She really let it fly. Yeah. And you can, I don't know if you can hear it in the clip that I sent you because I might have cut it off, but right after that you hear someone else in the cast like mimicking her. Like, what are you talking about? It's great. And so last week I made you watch Heathers.
And I loved it. And this week I made you watch Scream.
And I liked it.
Yeah.
I liked it more than I thought I would.
Good. I like that. I think that's pretty good.
I liked it more than I thought I would, especially after the first scene, the Drew Barrymore scene.
Yeah.
Because what that was doing was purposeful, and I knew that, but it was also doing the thing that I don't like about horror movies. So,
yeah, I think this is horror in general. I think Scream is a horror movie for fans of horror movies. I think,
which I am not. To be clear,
we'll get into the movie itself and what it's doing. Though I think it's one that I'd be pretty surprised if there were many people listening to this episode who hadn't already seen the movie.
Yes.
Before we announced it as our movie this week.
Yes, I am the odd one.
So I think a lot of the conversation around this movie has already been had. I think our sort of like unique, what we bring to it, to the viewing, is maybe what we'll talk a little bit more about.
An appreciation for Neve Campbell being hot at this period in her life. Is that what we're bringing to this? It was literally the first thing I texted you when I started watching it.
This is a movie where, so we talked last week about Heathers, and I said, I started to joke that it was a bunch of 30-year-olds.
Yes.
But it's not.
Right.
Heathers, it was actually like the leads were all pretty young.
Yeah.
This
pretty
is not
close
that.
To teenagers. Yes. No, this is not that.
I think Neve Campbell's like 23 when she made this movie.
Drew Barrymore had to be older than that, I would think.
Oh, Drew Barrymore. So here's the thing. I think Drew Barrymore was mid.
Oh, actually, maybe not. Because
she's like mid-20s, but she's younger than I think you would think.
Right. I think you're right. Because she's been around for so long.
She's been around for so long, but there are kind of two periods of Drew's career that are sort of split, I think, with this movie. Because there's young Drew. Well, maybe there are like
Drew Barrymore is exactly my age.
Oh, wow. So how old were you in 96?
That's a great question. So she was born in February 75. I was born in October. But so she was, 75 to 96 is 21 years.
So she was
She was pretty young.
Yeah. Which I think, we know her as Baby Drew in movies like E.T. And then she had that kind of like bad girl phase-ish. And then they bring her in for this movie, which it's, everybody knows at this point, I think, that she was the bait and switch in this movie where you think that Drew is going to be our lead girl and by extension our final girl.
Right.
And they don't do that. They use Drew's scene as a way to like set up and remind and reinforce the tropes of these kinds of horror movies.
Yeah, and to let you know that they're aware of them. That they're going to be fucking with them.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that is the one thing about this movie that I did know after all these years of not watching it is that Drew Barrymore dies in the first scene. Like that was not a surprise to me.
Which is kind of a bummer because that's such a fun such a fun choice for this movie.
But I'm kind of glad I knew though, to be honest, because like I said, this is the part of horror movies I don't like. I literally, in my notes, which I've shared with you already that make no sense, that are all over the place, I said something about gross, I don't like movies where women die. And
I mean, that's
true.
that's every slasher movie.
I know.
Up to this point. And the thing about Drew in this movie, or Casey, is that she is, on the one hand, this scene does two things because it sets up what we expect from a typical slasher movie. She's home alone. She might as well be babysitting. She's not, but
Yeah.
It sets up, what you expect from one of these typical slasher movies, and it does set up those tropes. But it also lets you know that the women in this movie are not necessarily what you expect from this kind of movie, right? She's pretty, in terms of the first character to die in a horror movie, she does a pretty good job.
Yeah. I will say, though, this was my big first problem with this movie, was that, and I think I texted you about this, the 90s was the era of, like, prank calls, no caller ID, like, you would answer your phone, you didn't know who it was, and there is no fucking way a teen girl is entertaining some creep on the other line for that long. Like, at least I wasn't. I was too, like, cynical.
This is very North Jersey of you. You've got your head on a swivel.
I'm like, fuck this guy. Who the fuck are you calling me for?
These are West Coast kids.
They're too trusting.
But I also wonder if she just assumed that it was somebody, at least at first, somebody she knew, somebody from school. Because that's
I'm sure. Yeah. I just had this like gut reaction of like, hang up the phone, you idiot. Like, why are you talking to this person? And that happens again with a lot of people later where they answer the phone and they're like, this person's being creepy. I'm just going to keep talking to them. I'm like, what are you doing?
Yeah, I don't know why that part doesn't bother me.
Yeah.
I do, what I think is.
Okay, wait, let me ask you a question.
Yes.
When you were a teenager, were prank calls like a big thing? Or was it leaning closer to the time where like you could figure out who it was and people were doing it less?
They were a little bit, but not so much.
Okay.
No, not so much.
Because when I was a kid, prank calls were
obsessed with the Jerky Boys.
Right, yeah.
But in terms of like what kids were actually doing, not too much.
So in my childhood, prank calls were an epidemic. It was a plague.
That's so funny.
It was literally what people would get together and do for fun. I didn't, because I was a goody two shoes that was afraid someone would find out it was me.
Right.
And I would get sent to jail or something. But it happened a lot.
That's so funny.
So maybe it's just the weird part of North Jersey that I'm from, or maybe it's like the generational thing. But that was my first stumbling block, where I was like, you would hang up the phone in 3 seconds if you didn't know who it was.
Yeah, I think she's curious though.
Yeah.
I don't know how quickly I would have hung up.
Yeah.
But
I also have never trusted random men.
I mean, that's wise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she plays along. He's creepy pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So we've just kind of started running away with our conversation.
Yeah.
Tiny little bit of context, just because
we should actually talk about like the basis of the movie and like the story around it and all of that.
So it's
and then I'll talk about how prank calls were an epidemic.
Yeah, exactly. So Scream, 1996. I know horror movies are huge and have been forever, but we were in kind of a slump before this movie came out. Horror movies, the thing was like, I think we had a few good ones up top. Like we had the first Halloween, and we had, Wes Craven's first Nightmare on Elm Street and, the first one or two Friday the 13th. But then they just kind of like devolved, right? And a million sequels for all of those movies and so many slasher movies that are just like terrible knockoffs. In fact, you said you've never been a big horror fan.
No, but I did get bullied into watching them a lot as a kid, or peer pressured into watching them.
Well, that's the
so
thing.
I did see a good chunk of the ones they're referencing.
That was the same for me too. I still am kind of a big scaredy cat. I just really like. I wouldn't even say kind of. I'm a big scaredy cat, but I really like being scared. But when I was a kid, I didn't. But I was still a big scaredy cat. And I had a friend leading up. So this came out in '96. I was just pushing 11. It came out at the end of the year. It was like a Christmas movie, weirdly. And so
you were 11.
Leading up, I'm just a
You're
tiny
just a baby.
I'm pushing 40, but it's fine. I'm just gonna keep.
Wait, 96. Yeah, I was 21.
Yeah, so it was the end. It was the end of '96, so I was 11 the next month. But in the year or two leading up to this, I made a friend whose mom had a huge horror movie collection and also was never home.
Yeah,
and
well,
so after
who was?
Right, exactly, yeah. One of the many single moms in the neighborhood that I lived in. And we would almost every day go to her house and just pick any random horror movie and put it on. So I had no context for the sort of lineage and what inspired what, because we would just grab one and watch it. So I had seen and was terrified by a ton of bad horror movies.
Yeah.
And never really liked it for that reason, I think, because most of them were bad.
Yeah.
And so when I saw this movie, it was the first time I can remember being like, oh, horror is good and fun.
Right.
Like a good horror movie can be genuinely scary and exciting and fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously this has way more of a sense of humor than any of those other movies, which is a huge part of it. Like my favorite genre of movie is it's a tricky needle to thread, and there aren't a ton of them, but is the horror movie that is also funny, but in a way that treats the comedy and the horror both seriously, if that makes sense. And I think this is one of those movies for me anyway.
Definitely. Yeah, like I said, I'm not a fan of horror movies, but I say that and I think it sounds like I didn't watch them, which is also not true.
Right.
Because my friends in high school were a bunch of dudes that were really into metal and really into horror movies.
Right.
Of course.
You know the type.
Those guys, yeah. But yeah, so I was friends with a bunch of guys who were like metalheads and watched a lot of horror, and I was too embarrassed to admit that I didn't.
Right.
And
exactly.
so I watched all of them. So I watched Hello Mary Lou, Prom Night 2. I watched Candyman, all of those.
That's a movie I've never, this is so bizarre. I must have seen this movie when I was too young to remember it. But it is a movie that my family, when I was little, would just say the name of and I would cry.
Oh.
Because apparently I had, I don't know if I'd accidentally seen it before I was old enough to remember or what, but that is, there is a deep repressed trauma in my brain, I think, from that movie.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Mary Lou Prom Night 2, you just say that, I was like, oh, God, run. So it's one I've literally never seen.
That you remember.
And I'll bet it's... it's one that I have no memory of, but must have seen.
Yeah.
And I bet that if I watched it now, it would be bad and I wouldn't be scared.
Yeah, I only saw it once and I don't remember much about it other than it was your typical slasher movie. But I think that the reason that it was such a big thing with my friends was literally just the name.
Okay.
Because it's just such a
very silly
name. Yeah. And also we were in high school and it's a prom themed.
Oh, yeah.
Theoretically.
That's the thing, too, with so many of these movies. They have to be about high schoolers. And, this one is such a high school movie.
Yeah.
In a way that I think, and it's such a 90s high school movie in a way that Heathers, which we talked about last week, is such an 80s high school movie.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting because we talked about Heathers being such a huge influence on me, but I was in high school primarily in the early 90s. And so I kind of I related to the 80s high school nature of Heathers a lot. But when I watched this, I also related to the 90s high school nature of this, because like I wasn't going to college parties when I was in high school.
Right.
I was going to high school parties when I was in high school. And so that felt like the party scene, which I'm sure we'll talk about in Scream, felt, other than the murders, like very accurate.
Yeah, it feels, as somebody who obviously wasn't in school at the time that Heathers is set, Heathers feels like the thing that is being poked at, or I don't even know if satirized is exactly right, but is the high school experience. And it's done through the sort of violence and murders that are heightened there and are kind of an extension of what we think of the high school politics. It's not what's going on with this movie.
Right.
So I think the high school experience feels, aside from the murders, aside from the like slasher part of it, which is the horror movie is what's being poked at there. Aside from that, it feels to me anyway, from my experience, pretty authentic.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
You know, just talking about the party in general and how that feels, it does feel kind of like a high school party. This is such a small detail, but do you remember last week we talked about Heathers kind of creating the language? It's not reflecting how people were talking then. It's creating the way people talked after.
Yes.
And I said, I think Clueless does the same thing, but it's so part of my childhood that it was hard for me to say.
Yes.
But Clueless comes out in 1995 when Randy shows up and he finds out that Billy and Sid are upstairs talking. And he's like, oh, there goes my shot with Sid. And then Matt Lillard says, as if. And Randy's like, oh, as if, Alicia.
Yes.
Because it's so tied to, again, if that were just a thing people in the 90s said,
right,
that reference wouldn't have been so pronounced.
Yeah, no, I totally caught that too.
But it's only a year later
that's wild.
Like, yeah.
So should we like just quickly run through the plot of the movie, or is that like pointless with this movie that everyone has seen but me?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea because I want us to be able to refer back to the thing at the end that really kind of was so surprising and, you know.
Except to me.
So
I always suspect the boyfriend.
But what about the double?
No, the double I didn't suspect.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yes. Okay, so let's talk quickly about the plot, like literally like less than 5 minutes just to get us on the right page.
Yeah, if you want like a real breakdown, like scene by scene of this, there are so many
watch the movie.
Podcasts. Well, watch the movie, and then also because we're building a larger conversation related to other movies and to our previous watching habits and all of that. It's just this isn't what our off season is.
Yeah.
Is
nobody needs a recap of a movie that came out 20 years ago that's like in detail.
Well, I'm an obsessive, so I just don't think it's what our show is, and I think that's okay.
Also, 96 was more than 20 years ago.
Also, I haven't listened to it because, or no, that's not true. I haven't listened to this episode that I'm about to recommend since it aired last year, sometime, maybe even the year before. Because I specifically, when I know we're going to talk about something, I stay away from, because I don't. But anyway, I know Unspooled did an episode on it, and so that's the show to listen to if what you want is a really in-depth analysis of the movie itself, kind of devoid of
yeah.
So,
and I would also recommend.
Sure
I don't know if they've done Scream, but I wouldn't be surprised. I'm also a fan of the Rewatchables podcast on the Ringer podcast network. And they do something similar where they will like really go through with a fine-tooth comb the movie. So I'm not sure if they've done Scream, but if they have, that would be worth listening to also.
And because it has a million sequels and stuff, there are full-on podcasts that are dedicated to the Scream universe
franchise.
Yeah. So there are plenty of places. We're not, interested anyway. So all that to say, quickly,
yes,
Scream is about a high school in California, a group of friends. Our protagonist is Sydney Prescott, who a year before the events of the movie, her mother was brutally raped and murdered. The person who was accused of the killing is Cotton Weary, a man who,
great name.
Yeah, it's such a good horror movie.
So many good
villain
names
name.
in this movie.
It reminds me of Kane Hodder, who is the person in the Michael Myers jumpsuit in the Halloween movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of great names in this movie.
Yes.
And Sydney's testimony was like crucial in putting Cotton away.
Mm-hmm.
Movie opens, Drew Barrymore is murdered by somebody,
and her boyfriend, yeah,
and her boyfriend, horrifically. It's the goriest scene in the movie. And then the rest of the movie is Sydney trying to survive this killer who clearly has it out for her, and the people around her being kind of like systematically murdered.
Yeah.
We just want to spoil the end.
Yeah,
Not
let's just spoil it.
But the movie sets up pretty much everybody except Sydney as a possible suspect. And at the end, you find out that it is, in fact, her boyfriend and his best friend, I guess, Stu.
Played by
that's
Matthew Lillard.
Played wonderfully, incredibly, perfectly by Matthew Lillard.
Somehow I liked him more at the end when I knew he was a murderer than I did at the beginning when he was just a dick.
I know.
And a teenage boy.
Yeah. It is his character
a trick.
I am obsessed with how weirdly lovable he is and how sympathetic I feel about him in this
At least
movie.
compared to Billy.
Oh, big time. I mean, because Billy is pulling the strings so hard on poor. You find out at the end that Stu thinks the two of them are on some wild murder spree because it's like fun and exciting and murders are incidental or motives are incidental and then you find out that Billy has a very specific reason.
Yeah. Very, very specific vendetta against Sydney's family because her mom slept with his dad and like ended his parents' marriage.
Yeah. And so Stu does not seem to know the depth of that going into it.
Poor guy. I thought he was just killing people for fun and it turned out there was a motive.
Yeah. Well, I think, and God, I want to get into the love story between the confirmed love story between Billy and Stu.
Confirmed?
Yeah. So
tell me.
Well, so let's back up a little bit. So that's the movie.
Yes.
Directed by Wes Craven, one of our icons. He wrote and directed the first Nightmare on Elm Street. He wrote and directed the first one. He co-wrote and produced the third, which is Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, which is so silly. He also wrote and directed Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which is super meta. It's doing a version of what Scream ends up being later.
Yeah. That was like a sort of earlier attempt at the sort of meta commentary that this movie is.
Yeah. Oh, and then, I mean, hugely, he directed Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, The People Under the Stairs, which is one of those horror comedy movies that I loved as a kid. And then a few other things. I mean, I can fire them off. Red Eye, which is a movie I don't really care about. Swamp Thing, Serpent in the Rainbow, which fucked me up as a kid. Shocker, Vampire in Brooklyn, and then Music of the Heart, which is not a horror movie at all.
Little detour there.
Yeah. And
legend.
Absolutely. And so someone who deeply understands the genre, but who
helped create the current genre.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Movie was written by Kevin Williamson. Kevin Williamson, who wrote Scream, obviously, also Scream 2. Then also, I Know What You Did Last Summer, The Faculty, Teaching Mrs. Tingle. So these movies that were in the way that like we just fired off Wes Craven as being like, oh, he kind of really set a lot of the standard for the genre at the time. Kevin Williamson sort of ends up doing that again, because I think Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer, those two really set, because then teen slashers became a thing again.
Yeah, totally.
The Scream movies, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, which I kind of love. I think that one's maybe a little bit of a guilty pleasure, but and then again, all the movies that he wrote, like I said. But then also important to me is he's the creator and lead writer on Dawson's Creek.
Oh, okay.
Which is maybe my favorite show It is so important to me. My dog's name is literally Pacey.
Yeah.
It also explains something I really like about him that other people have also... You know that thing where people complain about teens in movies and TV shows not talking like teens?
Mm-hmm.
He's somebody who's very intentional about that. He's somebody who, like, he who shall not be named, though I'm going to name him, like Joss Whedon, who is a scumbag. But like Joss Whedon has done this thing of, like, I let my teens talk. I let my teens have the ability to articulate feelings that they might not have actually had the language for, or that I might not have had the language for when I was a teenager. Because it's not that teens don't talk like that because they have
no feelings or
like simple, uncomplex, like, inner lives. It's just, and so I like that. And so there are certain ways in Scream, I think, where the teens don't necessarily talk like teens, though I don't totally think that's true. I think
it didn't stand out to me as an unrealistic, maybe just because we watched Heathers last week, which is so mannered and so specific.
Yeah, totally.
This felt much more natural than that.
But the reason that Kevin Williamson, that I really want to talk about him, is, and why I said confirmed love story to an extent, is that Kevin Williamson is gay. I don't know that he was out at the time.
Nobody was.
Yeah, exactly. Stu and Billy are, whether or not confirmed or not, fully queer coded. And at the very least, Stu is, I think, pretty obviously obsessed with Billy in a way.
Yes.
But Kevin Williamson has said, Scream screenwriter Kevin Williamson confirms Billy and Stu's queer-coded relationship was based on real gay killers. This is a Pride Source article. And he says, it's very sort of homoerotic in the sense that there were these two guys that killed this other person just to see if they could get away with it. It's the Leopold and Loeb I'm just going to read from this a little bit. In May 1924, Leopold and Loeb, who've been called the LGBTQ plus prototype for Bonnie and Clyde, killed a 14-year-old Bobby Franks as an act of intellectual superiority. Obviously, this is very sad. I don't want to glorify that. It's been called the perfect crime, one that has influenced Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, as well as the 2002 crime thriller Murder by Numbers, and both of which are noted for their homoeroticism. Now, nearly 3 decades after Scream came out, theorists can finally categorize Scream in that same queer-coded realm. And now this is Williamson. It's very sort of homoerotic in the sense that there were these two guys that killed this other person just to see if they could get away with it, Williamson said, drawing parallels between the Leopold and Loeb case and Billy and Stu. And one of the reasons that one could get the other one to follow is because I think the other one was secretly in love with him. And it was sort of a fascinating case study on double murderers. If you Google Leopold and Loeb, you'll see, and you'll read about it and you go, okay, that's Billy and Stu. Huh.
That's interesting because not knowing any of that, I fully picked up on that in the movie. Like, I especially, like, I don't know if we need to go chronologically, but especially when we get to the end and the two of them are in the kitchen, it just, the body language was so there. Like, more so than any other time in the movie, because they do have to play this sort of both ways, so to speak. They have to play it like creepy teenage boy using words like tease and being icky and like pressuring her to have sex and all of that stuff, is like Billy does with Sydney. But also the relationship between the two of them has to be percolating enough that at the end, when you see them as this pair, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So, and I think that they did that because I got it when we got to that point. I was surprised, but also like they had this like physical connection in that scene in the kitchen that was like really specific.
Totally. And so, I like when our queer characters can be alpha murderers. I think that's good and important.
That's progress. Some of us suck. Yes.
I think, or at the very least, again, I said, that in love, I don't know that I think Billy...
No, I don't see it from that direction.
I think he's manipulating. I think Billy is well aware that Stu has feelings for him and is using that to get Stu to go along with.
Totally. I see that too. I think what I want to know from you if you can articulate it,
Mm-hmm.
why is this movie so important to you? Why was this the first one that you wanted me to watch when you found out I hadn't seen it?
So the first thing is, and I talked about this a little bit up top, is I think as someone who is a fearful person in general, like I said, I watched a lot of horror movies and did not have a good time watching them. As a young person, this is the first time where I really felt like I did, and where it kind of like made me feel like I could have a sort of control over my fear that way. And especially because I think the women in this movie, especially Sydney, though Casey to an extent, are not the same kind of, well, Casey's not a final girl, she's a first girl, but she's set up, she would be the final girl in the movie that it's setting up. She's so strong and she's so powerful, but not in a way that is unbelievable. Sydney makes some mistakes, though. When she says she doesn't like horror movies because they're all the same. It's always some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who always runs up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. They're ridiculous.
Yeah, and then she runs up the stairs later.
But only because she has to. But she knows. So I love that this is a horror movie that is the most kind of like realistic version of one of these that we've had. I think that's really you know what's hard is you're asking that question, and because it's so ingrained in my DNA, I was so young when I saw it, it's hard to say what things I love now because of this movie, you know, because I was just about to say, like, I'm such a sucker for anything that is making a comment on the thing that it is. I'm really interested in the meta part of it, but this is probably the first version of that I ever saw. So I can't even say it's because I was drawn to this. Like, I think it kind of created that interest in me. Again, maybe I'm just kind of teasing this out in a way that is a little overworked, but we're
making a podcast about a movie that's 30 years old.
Oh, Jesus Christ, Jodie.
Not 30. Almost, though.
Almost.
Yeah.
It is, I think, self-awareness in general and like introspection is really important. And I like that this is a movie that is doing that, but having fun with it.
Yeah.
I also was just in love with everybody in this movie when I was a kid. So just to be perfectly honest, like that's also.
Yeah. No, that makes sense to me. I think the thing that I really thought about throughout this entire movie that maybe relates to what you were saying about Neve Campbell's character is, and also relates to our conversation about Heather's last week, is the politics of teen male-female relationships at this time in the 90s and also in the late 80s with Heather's. Because we talked last week about how the scene at the party where Heather Chandler, who I kept calling Heather McNamara, Heather Chandler is not coerced, but kind of coerced into giving that college kid a blowjob. Like, and the fact that I didn't react to that at all watching that movie because like that was just so normal. A lot of things in this movie really kind of like set off my alarm bells in the same way watching it now as a 47-year-old. Like Billy's behavior towards Sydney. Like that's why I said like I suspected it was him for most of the movie because of the way that our culture now recognizes the toxicity of that specific interaction. Him pressuring her to have sex, him calling her a tease, him like showing up at her house just to kind of, you know, see how far he could get with her. Those
scenes are gross and become more so the older I get. And because they're played up till when they actually do have sex, they're played kind of playfully in a weird way. Like yes. He says the thing of the like some over the clothes stuff, but then immediately starts to like try to put his hand under her nightgown. So that's the first thing. But then when she makes him leave, it's not in like for the mystery of who the murderer is to work. You can't totally distrust Billy.
Right.
And I think in 96 we didn't.
No, exactly.
Watching it now, exactly as you were saying, like,
if I had seen this movie when I was in high school, I would have not had the same radar go off at all about his behavior.
Right.
You know, like, it's interesting to think about this movie being written when it was written and who the killer ended up being. Watching it now, I feel like it's more obvious than it would have been if I was watching it in high school, because that kind of behavior was so normal. He mentions the underwear rule, like all this stuff about like the boundaries she's trying to keep and that he's trying to push and all of that. Like, that to me now is so fucking creepy and so gross. But in high school, I would not have thought about it that way.
Right.
It was so normal.
This stuff with Sydney and sex is so interesting to me. We're back, folks. I'm going to put that on your bingo card.
It's so
Andrea's
interesting.
Andrea finds something interesting because when he says, and it's gross, but when they're talking, he says, like, when we first started, we were like an R, you know, on our way to an NC-17.
Right.
Sydney is not having sex with Billy. I get the impression that, and it didn't really occur to me until this time watching it, thinking about the conversation we had about Heathers last week. Sydney is not having sex with Billy. I don't get the impression, because she's like saving herself for marriage or something like that. And she's in a horror movie and our lead girl is quote unquote supposed to be a virgin. That's like a big deal. But she's also, what I like about this movie is that Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven I don't think they're interested in that beyond the trope of it, because I think the reason Sydney's not having sex with Billy is because her mom was raped and murdered a year ago.
Exactly. Yes.
Like, that is a perfect, not that there are any bad reasons to not have sex. I don't mean that. But you and I have talked about how, like, high schoolers have sex.
Yeah. And everyone, I literally have a note that says all the teenagers I knew in the 90s were having sex, which is true.
When it wasn't a huge deal that they make it in movies in general. Yeah. I mean, obviously that's not true for everybody, but so it's, I like that they preserve that trope for Sydney, because it's interesting at the end for her to have sex, and then you think, you know, if this were one of those horror movies that it's commenting on, she would die.
Right.
But it doesn't happen. And again, it's not because her virginity is being associated with some sort of like purity or goodness.
Right. No, totally. I like what you said about how it's like the only thing it's used for in that way is to comment on it.
Right.
Like, she's not being shamed for being a sexual person at all in the movie. I didn't feel.
No.
It's more like, I immediately was like, when I found out that her mom had been raped and murdered, I'm like, oh, that's why she's not having sex with him.
Yeah.
She's
obviously.
in a trauma. Like, that has to do with sex also, even though she wasn't raped. It doesn't matter. Like, that's, I mean, yeah. So anyway, all that to say, I was fully creeped out by his behavior in the beginning. And I think that that's why I was less surprised than maybe I would have been had I watched this in high school.
Yeah, watching this as an adult, knowing how, like, I had a picture of him in my, like, I should say the notebook that my friends and I passed around in like that following year. There was a picture of him on the inside cover. Like, he's also, oh my God, he's also gross, though less greasy, but still gross in The Craft. But between those two movies, like, but it says a lot that he was gross in both of those movies, and I still was fully in love.
Some of us were into gross dudes.
Like, we were conditioned to be.
Yeah. No, totally. But I mean, like, I will say that when I was watching movies like this, when I was a teenager, I absolutely was attracted to the skeet Ulrich guy, not the football player, 100% of the time.
Oh, Steve?
Yeah, who cares? But so just to kind of keep talking for a minute about the male-female politics in this movie, because I do think it's super interesting and indicative of the time.
Hold on. I don't want to talk too much about anything spoilery with Yellowjackets. But one of the interesting things about Yellowjackets for the high school part is because they've all been removed from their high school experience where we don't see, other than Travis and Nat, who are in a completely extraordinary circumstances, but like, we don't see a lot of the high school politics in general, like, play out very differently in the woods. But then also it's interesting to see how this stuff changes when you remove
the setting
from that setting. Yeah. That's all.
Totally.
Anyway.
But I think that, so I don't want to take this from like a fun podcast to a not fun podcast, but the Violence Against Women Act was passed 2 years before this movie came out.
Mm-hmm.
And domestic violence dropped significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was repealed.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about this movie that I was uncomfortable with was only related to real world experiences. And like, I know this is a fantasy, it's a horror movie, it's pulling on all these tropes, but like these tropes exist for a reason.
Yeah.
And like, again, not to get too dark, but I recently texted you about the girl that I grew up with who was one of my, there were two women, girls growing up that were really, really hard on me. They were very, very big time bullies, made my life hell, all that stuff. One of whom just recently followed me on Instagram. The other one, however, was murdered by her husband.
Mm-hmm.
And he took off with her 2 children. And she was stabbed to death by him. And like, so part of watching this for me is like, oh, this is fun. This is the 90s. Look at the phones. Why are there so many doors? Like, you know, they keep calling cell phones cellular phones. Like, all of the silliness of that. But it's sort of the flip side of that is the slasher movie trope itself is still hard. Like I said, I don't like movies where women are killed.
Yeah.
You know? And like, this is a real thing.
Yeah. And it isn't to say that women weren't murdered before this, and so it was easier in 96.
Absolutely not. No.
But the conversation is obviously so much bigger now and so much more in our culture. It's funny that you say that because I was thinking about it in terms of, again, which I can't not for any high school movie, Columbine. Like the way that we say like Heathers couldn't be made now in the same way.
Yeah.
Weirdly, we know that's not the case for Scream because a new one came out this year.
Right. Yes.
And I think like I don't know why it's different. I guess it's different because it's not just women being murdered in the Scream movies. It's not just high schoolers being murdered in the Scream movies. So I think that opens it up a little bit. But there's a moment, again, another movie.
Sorry, just to quickly interrupt. Also, it's self-aware about the fact that women are the focus of these movies and the fact that there's all these tropes around women and victimhood that it's aware of and playing with.
Right.
And so that, I think, allows it like to do it without being blind to it. Like I said when we started, I liked this movie, even though it brought up all this shit for me.
Right. All of that can be true, and it can still be hard to watch those scenes for
as a woman who is aware of the violence that is available to us at all times, you know?
Right, right. There's a little moment that stopped me that I'd never noticed or thought about before. But again, on the heels of our Heathers conversation and our Columbine conversation, when Dewey drops them off at school, he says, "It's school, you'll be safe here." Yeah. And we know, like, again, our fun podcast, but like we know that's not true. Yeah. That's not true at all. And it, to an extent, slasher movie or not, it wasn't true in 96 really. Like there were all kinds of, but
it's never really been true. But there is this like sort of period of time where it went from the kind of violence you could expect to experience in school was fights, people getting beat up, emotional violence,
right,
things like that. And we're talking obviously about a certain suburban high school experience that is always portrayed in these movies, right? Like obviously it's within that realm. But where it went from a certain kind of violence that could be expected in high school, you know, like somebody threatening to beat you up on the playground after school or whatever, you know, or like emotional violence to something much more extreme in school shootings.
Right.
So yeah. But high school's never been a safe place. It just got a lot less safe in like the mid 90s.
Exactly. Yeah. Shortly after this movie.
Yeah.
That's just a line that you wouldn't be able to say so offhandedly now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can imagine for people that are younger than me that haven't seen this movie, I feel like watching it would be a very different experience because of that, like, sense of school not being a safe place ever.
Right.
And the scenes where there's like reporters in front of the school and the cops are there, like that is an experience that a lot of my students have had in high school, you know, or in elementary school where, you know, there's reporters outside their school because there was a shooting.
That's such a good point, where even if not to the degree that to the degree that is happening in this movie, or then in our reality with schools, like I'll keep using Columbine as the shorthand because it's a little more in the distance, and so that feels a little easier to me. But
I've had students that have been in some of those major recent school shootings, and like I feel like they could still appreciate this movie for the silly slasher film that it is and for its meta commentary, but I think that there are scenes that might read differently to them.
Right.
You know, than they do to me, or even to you, you know, from the specific generation that you're from.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is, and it's crazy that, so when was Heathers?
88.
88. So this isn't even 10 years.
Yeah. 96
later.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it definitely, like, it feels like a different generation of movie for sure.
Yeah.
I found an article that maybe we should link to, that kind of gives the context that I was talking about with the Violence Against Women Act and all of that, from the Smithsonian Magazine.
Okay.
Came out in 2021. Because they also talk about the way that this movie portrays the media as sort of like, as Courtney Cox's character, as this like sort of unfeeling vulture.
Yeah.
That's exploiting these kids basically. And I think that's another really interesting angle on this, because of the 90s-ish turn towards sensationalism, 24-hour news, like, you know, the way that these cases, like, we all watched the fucking OJ truck drive around the Bronco, you know? And so that's, it's so common now for these things to be that sensationalized that we don't recognize it anymore, I don't think, in the same way. But in the 90s, this was kind of a new thing.
Yeah, Gail writing her book is seen as kind of, I mean, it is slimy, but it's a slimy thing that happens all the time now. True crime is... Jesus Christ,
yeah. True crime podcasts. Like, I was just going to say, just to end my thought about the Smithsonian article, in that article, they talk about how the debate about on-screen violence was really prominent in the mid-90s. So it says, like, and I'm quoting here, Americans were increasingly worried that graphic on-screen sex and violence would lead to a drastic rise in antisocial behavior. And President Clinton, even at the time, introduced something called the V-chip for televisions, the violence chip, that allowed parents to block certain programming.
Oh, yeah.
Based on a rating system.
I forgot about the V-chip, yeah.
Yeah. And so this was right at that time. And so all of that is kind of in the ether as well.
God, that's so... I have like 12 things I want to say now just based on that. Which is, so the first thing is, I'm going to keep pointing back to Heathers, because the people sensationalizing what's going on in Heathers are... the media's there, right? There are scenes, but it's also the teachers and the community in general.
The media is not the focus in the same way.
Exactly. Yeah. And then in Scream, there's that scene with the two shitty girls that Sydney overhears talking in the bathroom, who feel like they could be in a movie like Heathers.
It feels like they were in Heathers, yeah.
Yeah, and she says they're going back and forth about who it could be. And the one girl says, like, cut Sydney some slack. She watched someone get murdered. And the other one's like, yeah, and it fucked her up royally. She says, one day she snaps. She wants to kill herself, but realizes teen suicide is out this year. And homicide is a much healthier therapeutic expression. Like, that just feels like such a direct...
It feels like it was pulled from Heathers.
Yeah.
Like, Heathers 2 years later. 10 years later, whatever. Yeah.
And it's, you asked why this movie, and we went back and forth for a little while, and I think the more obvious and natural follow-up to Heathers is a movie like Jawbreaker, which is another Rose McGowan movie, actually, which is much more about the high school, like satirizing the high school experience more so than a specific genre of movie. But it's interesting. There are still things like this that do come up in this movie that when I was thinking about what our follow-up would be, that this was the one that it really stuck with me. And then the other one asked, where do you get this shit? She says, Ricky Lake.
Yes. I did love the reference to Ricky Lake, the hold that she had on us.
Yeah. And again, speaking of like sensationalized media, like this movie knows exactly what it's doing there.
Yeah. So just to wrap up that little bit about that article, the thing that I thought was super interesting was that actually violent crime decreased really sharply around this time. So it says, I'm quoting, in reality, violent crime decreased sharply by 10% from 1995 to 96, marking a third year of decline. The dramatic dip was likely due in part to the 1994 Violence Against Women Act, which strengthened legal protections against domestic violence. In 1991, 60% of women who were murdered knew their attacker, including half who were killed by a spouse or partner. Before the law was enacted, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking were considered quote-unquote family matters, and protection orders were invalid beyond state lines. So this is the conversation that was happening at this time also, which I think is super interesting, that this movie somehow managed to play with that idea in a way that, while it did kind of like raise alerts for me, I wasn't, I still liked the movie. I wasn't offended by it.
Right.
You know?
Because this sort of like the V-chip and the idea that horror movies and video games make people violent and all of that, as opposed to what good horror does, which is rather than like creating fears, like a good horror movie is a way to wrestle with the fear that already exists. And that's why I'm not saying anything new here.
Yeah.
That's why what kind of horror movies are popular at what time are such a direct way to trace what the anxieties of a culture are.
Yeah. And it's also, you know, horror can be a really great way to create metaphor for larger societal problems, as evidenced by, of course, the brilliant Jordan Peele and Get Out, as well as his later films, but specifically Get Out is the one that I saw and loved.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
Or how we see things like zombie movies. Again, this is for anyone who spends any time thinking about horror at all. You've heard this. This is not me breaking any ground. But, you know, zombie movies becoming a big deal again in the 80s, right around the same time as the AIDS epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, good film and media wrestles with the issues of the day in a way that allows us to see them through another lens, right? And I do think that even though I didn't love this movie, I appreciated it, and I actually was willing to watch it again to like pick stuff out. And I liked it. I laughed. There were moments that I enjoyed. Like, I think because we had recently had a conversation about the girl I grew up with that was murdered by her husband, that lens just covered this entire movie for me. From the moment that Billy starts pressuring her to have sex, I was like, it was very reactive. Because like last week, we also talked about Brett Kavanaugh and the trial and the behavior of men, and specifically in the 90s, but also now, and sometimes worse now, like, you know, the whole incel movement that we brought up, like all of that is like also flying around in my brain as I'm watching this like really fun horror movie that is dealing with some of the same issues, but not in the way that they've been in my brain lately.
Right. Although I will say it feels really good when Gail comes in with the gun in her hand. Yeah. And she says, like, you know, she like gives this new ending, and then Sydney says, I like that ending, and you see them pair up, and the movie ends with the two of them as our heroes.
Absolutely. Yes.
Feels so good.
Yes, 100%. And the fact that like there's that moment at the very end where Randy says something about how this is when the killer would show that he wasn't dead yet.
He's like, whoa.
And Billy like sits up and she shoots him in the head. And it's like, yeah, like it does have a very, from that perspective, a very satisfying ending.
It is very funny that Sydney puts the costume on to kill him with the umbrella, though, at the end when she's in the closet.
Yeah.
That's a choice.
That costume is so silly. I know that this has been discussed to death, but that guy was just, and now knowing that it was Matthew Lillard, I think the satisfying part of looking back at the killer himself in those scenes is how silly and lanky and like
they're high school boys,
bumbly.
Like, yeah,
he is.
They're not. I mean, they do a lot of murder, but they're high school. Like they're not practiced killers. They think they are. They think they are because they've watched a lot of horror movies.
Yeah. But the killer, like as he's running around chasing people, looks like his legs and arms are too long.
He's still growing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jesus,
which is why it made me laugh.
There are a couple of very silly some of the jump scares in this movie are great, and some of them are so funny and so silly. There's the one, it's not really a jump scare, but I remember as a kid it startling me when Sydney's outside during the day and then you see Ghostface like scamper by. He looks like Bigfoot at one point. He looks, he's like down the barrel. He like almost looks into the camera.
Yeah. That's what I mean about the silliness of it.
Yeah.
Like it's,
but I think that's what I mean, where I think the movie knows in those moments that it's being funny.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yes. I think it's fully intentional. I mean, like I read a bunch about how they kind of settled on that mask, but I think the thing that struck me about the costume was not so much the mask because it's so ubiquitous at this point. Mm-hmm. But the fact, and I think I texted you this, his black cape outfit thing is sparkly. It looks like sparkly felt that you would buy from like Michael's.
Yeah. Well, because, he bought it at a store because he's a high school kid.
Yeah.
I guess they have cars, but they're like going out after school and picking the like scariest quote unquote costume that they could. And that's what they got.
Yeah.
So
no,
good.
It made me laugh when I noticed that.
Yeah, we talked very serious about a lot of serious things because I think that is worth doing. But also, there are so many fun things like that in this movie.
Totally.
That are so over the top. Like when Henry Winkler, who, again, he's somebody who is beloved now, right? But I don't think he was doing much after he was the Fonz and before this movie.
This feels like an in-between, like he appeared out of nowhere.
Yeah. And he's so goofy and kind of lovable and reasonably angry, and there is about 10 seconds where you think maybe he's the killer.
Yeah, they give him a moment of us thinking that.
Which is really fun, and then he scares himself with the and there's the leather jacket in his closet in the principal's office.
Oh, I totally missed that.
And then when he goes out into the hallway and the janitor's there, it's so not. First of all, that's Wes Craven.
I know. I've read that after the fact. Yeah.
Fully dressed as Freddy.
As Freddy
and his name
Krueger.
is Fred.
Yes.
It's not you, Fred. Like any one of those things would have been could have been like a subtle nod, but they lay it on
so thick.
So thick.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it so much.
Yeah. Totally. I also, phones have a really significant and time-specific role in this movie. Everything from like the brick cordless phones to like
that phone is.
Yeah, to the newness of cell phones at the time. Mm-hmm. Everybody calling them cellular phones, like we said. But
the
also,
fact alone that Billy has one is enough to incriminate him in Sid's eyes.
Yeah. Yes. So for people that are younger than us, or maybe even people your age, I don't know. But like I got my first cell phone in 1995 and
you were ahead of the curve.
I was. There weren't a lot of other people I knew that had them. I had it specifically because I was commuting to Montclair and my dad was worried I would like get stuck on the highway. And so I barely used it. It was just to have, I didn't use it really to call people even. I just had it in case
it was
I broke down and needed to call my dad. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my grandparents had a car phone that I don't think they ever used.
Yeah.
And I didn't get my first cell phone. I got my first cell phone in high school. It was a little brick thing.
Like Nokia.
It was a Nokia. I thought it was incredible because you could download the little MIDI like ringtone, and I had Take on Me.
Nice.
And I probably paid $5 for it.
Yeah.
And I think I was a junior, senior in high school, and I was pretty early to having my own cell phone even then. Like,
Yeah. That was not normal back then.
yeah, I would say like less than half of my friends had their own phone.
Yeah.
Because first of all, they were expensive. Like,
They were.
and parents thought, like, I think didn't like the idea. It's funny now because I think parents didn't like the idea of you having something unmonitored like that.
Well, it really was like a safety thing for a lot of us when we first got them.
Yeah, I had mine. I paid for mine because I worked from the age that I could. Like, I got my
same.
first job, my first like actual like on the books job when I was 14, which was
Same.
the earliest you could legally do that.
Yep. King
and I think
Supermarket in Ridgewood.
I worked at a fast food. This is when we play the like Jersey bingo card. I worked at a fast food restaurant in the Echelon Mall. Was my first job, but when I got my cell phone, I was working at a movie theater, and I would close, so it would be like I'd be leaving the theater after midnight.
Yeah. And
so
when I worked in my video store job, I was often the last person there closing up and had my phone with me.
Yeah.
But
But so in '96, that was not typical. So
it was
just the fact
unusual
alone-
that he had it
Yeah.
for sure. And also just the red herring of the calls coming from his dad's number or her dad's number, excuse me. And how it was like, oh, but he cloned the number, and how that was like a weird, like...
The way they say that so offhand is if those two dingbats would know how to clone. Like,
I just
what?
assumed that they like killed the dad and stole the phone or
And
something.
took his phone. Yeah, that was my first thought too.
Yeah. The idea of cloning the phone number, like, I don't think so.
Also, this is me. When I don't know if I'm too young or too old for it not to make sense to me when she calls or IM's 911.
I know. That was... I don't know that that's possible. Maybe it had to have been, but...
It must, yeah, but it's such a weird... That wasn't I don't... If you're younger than Jodie and I, people were not calling 911 from their computers.
Not that I know of.
Right?
I don't think so.
I also don't know how you would have done that if your line was cut.
You needed the phone line to be on the internet.
Unless she was one of those fancy people with a second phone line.
Yeah, but if you cut the phone to the house, doesn't that cut both lines?
Oh, yeah. They're not
there's like
separate,
a splitter.
physical. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was a fancy kid. I had my own phone line.
I did eventually, but not yet. Anyway.
Yeah.
Not in 96.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know what that was about.
That was weird. So there were some other things besides phones that were really fun, sort of 90s references. Both of us, we have spoken about before, worked in video stores. You at Hollywood Video and me at Empire Video. And all the old plastic cases, we literally talked about this when we did our superlatives for Yellowjackets. And we talked about like what one of them would become TikTok famous now and what for. And we were saying how Van would be famous on TikTok for like the ASMR videos of the VCR cases and the rewinder.
Randy would have been somebody who saw that and then also did it. He would pick up on the trend.
Yeah. No, I loved seeing all the old, like the video store setting for part of it. And all the old tapes and cases that were laying around. Because that was the year, I think, 96. I think I was working in the video store in 96. Yeah, I definitely was. I worked at the video store I was out of high school. It was like right after my senior year, actually, which feels like a little late to have that kind of job. But I was in college. Yeah,
we still had VHS tapes, and we were making the switch to DVDs when I worked there. So we could buy our VHS tapes. And just keep them.
We had VHS tapes. We also had, what were they? The big ones.
Like the laser discs?
Yes.
There's a movie on there.
Yes, we had those too for a while.
It's from SLC Punk. You haven't seen that, right?
I did one time.
Oh, God.
Long
that's
time
another
ago.
One. That's another one. Depending on how long this strike goes, we might end up watching SLC Punk.
Okay.
Another Matt Lillard movie.
The 90s cars in this movie made me happy too.
Uh-huh.
There really aren't station wagons anymore like they used to be.
Yeah, the cars are pretty fantastic.
And the crank
fashion.
windows. Like when she's rolling up the windows as he's like approaching the car. It just reminded me so much of having to drive on the Parkway to go to college every day. Like I was a commuter to Montclair and I had crank windows. And
So leaning across.
Well, and also for our Jersey listeners, the Parkway, you had to have the 35 cents. You had to roll the window down as you were going. You had to have that motion where you would like be rolling the window down, throw the coins in, keep driving.
No hands on the steering wheel.
No hands on the wheels. I drove stick also, like my whole growing up. So like kids today will never know.
Only 90s kids will know.
The skill set involved in driving a manual transmission with crank windows on the Garden State Parkway in 1996 and having to pay those tolls.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Not a skill set that comes into my daily life these days, but
No.
I was very good at it.
No.
Yeah.
The 90s fashion in this movie, Tatum is impeccably dressed at all times.
Eyebrows.
So ridiculous.
The tiny eyebrows.
Just the littlest eyebrows.
A little line.
Tiny eyebrows for the women, gigantic shirts for the men.
Yes.
Matt Lillard just swimming in his clothes in this movie.
Absolutely.
He's such
And
a
of
clown.
course the 90s hair.
Oh,
We talked about this. I don't know if we were on mic yet about how I had that Nev Campbell haircut.
those bangs, those big, beautiful bangs.
Yes. But not 80s bangs.
No.
They were like not big in that way. They were just full.
Well, full is a great, because you know what it was? The bangs I had were when I was a kid, I had really long hair. I have long hair now, but it was like down to my waist. And I cut it when I was little. And so we had to get it fixed, and they fixed it by giving me what was basically like a bowl cut. And then when I grew it back out, I left the front of the bowl cut. So my bangs were as thick, and they started in the middle of my head as all of the rest of my hair. And so you didn't have to, because in the 80s you would have less bangs, and so you would have to roll them and blow them out so that they could get big and voluminous. But that's just Nev's hair doing Nev, you know?
Yeah. Do you want to wax poetic about Matthew Lillard at all? Because you really wanted to when we were texting last night about this, or 2 nights ago. The lines that he has in the end of the movie, in general.
His dialogue in this movie is perfect from beginning to end. The scene, I don't know why I know it by heart, but when they're out, it's because I've seen this movie so long. That was a stupid thing, or so many times. That was a stupid thing to say. But he starts being perfect and horrible when they're talking about the murder.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
they do the how do you gut someone? He's like, well, you take a knife and you slit him from
He
sternum.
starts explaining it.
Yeah. And I really like, it's called tacked you fuck rag. We just made up curses in the 90s.
Yes.
She also, Sydney also calls him a goon fuck in that scene. Again, not an actual curse, but sure.
No.
But when he and Billy reveal themselves to be the co-murderers, but you learn very quickly that Billy is actually the one calling the shots. And then every one of Stu's lines from that point on, he is so pathetic.
Yeah.
And he becomes so, like you said, it doesn't really make sense, but he becomes so much more likable.
Yeah, he does.
When Sydney asks him what his motive is.
Yes.
And he's like, peer pressure. Far too sensitive.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of true.
Yeah.
This is Billy's idea. Like,
I don't think we can excuse the murdering.
I think you and I have different thresholds for the kinds of murders and justifications we will excuse.
Possibly. Seems like that may be the case.
I feel like it's come up in Yellowjackets as well.
Yeah.
I just have maybe this is a difference between North and South Jersey that we could trace back somewhere. But yeah, and then when Sydney says, that's the other great thing, is that throughout this whole movie nobody is able to call the cops like because they keep cutting the lines, but because they're at Stu's house, he thinks, you know what I mean, they're in charge, so she's able to call the cops.
Right.
And he says, did you really call the cops? She's like, you bet your ass I did. He's like, my mom and dad are gonna be so mad at me.
Yeah.
I think he means that. He really is like, oh no, I hadn't considered how my parents will feel about the fact that I'm a murderer until this moment.
Yeah. I also like when he says, I'm feeling a little woozy here.
Yeah. That's the other thing that's really sad, is that he and Billy have orchestrated, listeners can't see Jodie's face, but she's working through what I just said about the teen murderers. But he has gone into this up until the scene thinking that the two of them are on equal footing.
Yeah.
And they've practiced, and the plan is they're going to stab each other, but not bad enough to kill, only to make it believable that they're actually the heroes, that they were both attacked by Sydney's dad.
Yes.
And that they both survived. And so
he says,
Stu
you cut
stabs,
me too deep.
Stu stabs Billy, but then Billy keeps stabbing Stu. Not only does he cut him too deep, he like slashes his arms, and it's like when Stu has to kind of tap out, he's like, I can't take anymore, man. It's like, I feel bad for him in that moment.
Yeah. I don't know if I would go so far as to say I feel bad for him.
I think that's a testament to how likable and charming I have always found Matthew Lillard.
Yeah. And how annoying I have always found him. Like, the fact that I even remotely like him at the end of this movie says something about his performance, because I generally do not like any character that man has ever played.
Wow.
It's just a generational thing.
Yeah, it totally is.
Like, I was annoying.
He's in movies we've talked about already. Serial Mom, a movie I love, was before Scream.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if have we talked about Hackers?
I don't know. I saw Hackers.
Hackers is another one of those. I don't think we'll talk about it on this show because it doesn't make sense. But in the blender of pop culture that makes up Andrea, you have to put Hackers, Scream, and SLC Punk all go in the blender for me.
That fully makes sense to me.
And but I don't stand a chance when it comes to Matt Lillard.
Which is so funny because for me, none of the movies that he's most known for are I did like Hackers, but I don't have the same gut level emotional connection to a lot of the movies that he's been in because of the generational thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. He's also a great spit actor. He has there's no vanity with Matt Lillard playing upset. He will draw
that's very true.
He does it in his he's got a scene in SLC Punk that is so heartbreaking, and he is drooling everywhere while he's crying.
Yes, he definitely. Oh, he was in an episode of House. Something we spoke about last week, just as a one-off.
And then, of course, Shaggy. I don't actually care about the Scooby-Doo movies, though I know people love them. Actually, weirdly, I think they're one of those things that have become a cult kind of.
Yeah, no, I don't have any interest in that.
Oh, hold on. There's a She's All That sequel called He's All That, and he plays the principal.
What?
This
is news.
That's very Saved by the Bell. The new class, Principal Screech.
Yep. That is news to me. So the party scene where the news van shows up, and she ends up going into the party with Dewey, which made no sense to me. No teenage people would let a cop and a reporter into their party randomly. But I don't care that he's her brother. There's no way they're getting in the door.
Yeah, there's no way. The only sort of justification is and Gail makes a point to emphasize this at the end. This is a very small town. They do all know each other.
Still, they're not getting into any teen party.
Maybe with the murders happening, they feel like. I guess I'm trying.
Yeah, I'm not getting there with you, but I almost texted you this too. As soon as I saw the van pull up to the party, immediately in my TV-addled childhood brain, I heard the phrase, "There's that news van again."
There's that news van again. That's such a cool little thing where they're watching it all happen through the news van monitor, and then they realize there's the delay.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really cool stuff in this movie that has to do with like screens and surveillance. And the news is a really obvious one, but just like cool stuff with the parallels where what's happening on the TV screen when they're watching Jamie Lee Curtis and
also when Dewey's going through the house checking it out, and if you didn't have the subtitles on, which I did, you would have maybe thought that the noise that he was hearing was actually things happening in the house, but it was on the TV.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which for us as the viewer is the same. So
right.
Yeah, there's just so much fun stuff like that.
Yeah. No, I enjoyed it. I kind of was dreading watching it just because I don't love horror movies. But I also did know that because of the type of movie that I was aware that it was, that I wasn't going to have the same feelings as if like you had asked me to watch, like I said, Saw or something like that.
Right. Which again, I would never do. It's also obviously not a perfect execution for the reasons that we talked about. And the sort of like meta commentary in general is almost bordering on hack at this point, or like,
but it wasn't then, I don't think.
No, I don't think it was at all.
Yeah.
And hack isn't even really the right word, but it's a way like some people think they're being clever by just being self-referential, and it doesn't always work. I think it really works in this movie.
Well, because this was one of the first sort of like pop culture phenomenon type movies that really got out there that was doing this. Like, at least in our generation. So I think maybe to kind of bring this conversation to a close, I can say what I learned from this movie.
Yes. What did you learn from this movie?
I learned that teenage boys and the patriarchy are the real villains in society. Done.
Finally took
Figured
this
it out.
movie and this viewing.
No offense to any teenage boys that might be listening, or former teenage boys. But yeah.
Yeah, weird how because I mean, I know you're like half joking, but
I'm really not.
all of this really starts, if you think about it. Sydney's mom is murdered because she was allegedly sleeping with Billy's dad, and then he blames her for
breaking up his parents' marriage.
Right. And that
he doesn't blame his dad.
No, not at all. He's like barely a character. Like he barely matters at all in this movie.
Yeah.
It's
always the woman's fault.
Right. And then he and Stu slut shame that dead woman after they kill her.
Yep.
It's like flashing her shit around town like she was Sharon Stone or something. And let's
after
face it,
they,
her mother was
not to get too serious, but after they rape and kill her. That didn't need to be a part of it.
Oh my God. This is the first time that I have separated out the rape and murder.
Yeah.
Not that murder is not that in the hierarchy of crimes it would be okay if they hadn't.
There's no good way to have this part of the conversation.
No, I'm realizing that now. Yeah. Oh my God.
Don't talk yourself into a corner here.
Jesus. Yeah, maybe we just move past that.
Well, but I do think it's important to recognize that like part of the reason I had such a specific reaction to this movie is because it's really, like, if you break it down like we just did about why her mom is murdered and raped, right? It's really fucking dark.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of glossed over in this in a way that is not uncommon, I guess, for the time. But if you really break it down and think about it, it's horrifying.
Yeah, and in fact, I often forget, even though it's such a huge plot point, that it was only a year ago, that this is happening on the 1-year anniversary, because it seems so distant. And then thinking about the fact that Billy and Sydney have been together for 2 years, which means a year into their relationship, he raped and murdered her mother, and then the two of them continued to be involved with her.
Yeah.
Like, and she didn't know that whole time.
Yeah.
Is horrifying.
Yeah. And like, maybe she didn't want to sleep with him because part of her had some weird vibes.
Her body was, he did not pass her vibe check.
The body does keep the score, as they say.
As they say. And that is difficult. That is very difficult.
Yes. Well, you can always count on me to end things on a down note.
A couple of recommended, if you like, that I'll just throw out here. Recommended if you like a horror movie that is aware of the genre it's in and can play in those tropes without like making a total mockery. This is such a tricky needle. Mockery of it, and also be genuinely funny, where the humor doesn't necessarily come from making well, I guess making fun of is kind of, Scream is kind of doing that.
Yeah.
But it's doing it in a way that still takes it seriously. Right? It's the horror isn't the funny part. Like, the horror is horrifying, and also the movie is very funny and poking at. Anyway, Josh Rubin is one of my absolute favorites. He's so good with this kind of thing. He's made a handful of movies in the last few years, but two of them that I highly, highly recommend are Scare Me.
Okay.
Which is a movie that,
obviously.
I love Scare Me. I could talk forever about Scare Me. Written, directed, produced, starring Josh Rubin. And it's a movie about two horror writers who end up in cabins next door to each other. And that's all. One of them's a woman, one of them's a man. The woman is more famous and obviously from the outset more talented. Jodie, that movie is so good. You should watch Scare Me. That movie's great. And then Werewolves Within, which is a take on the werewolf genre. He's I think directed. He's not in it, and it is so funny and so good and genuinely scary. He's like my favorite, maybe my favorite like horror writer, director, filmmaker, whatever. Right now, he loves the genre and he's very funny, and both of those things are
Well, and Jordan Peele does not need our help, but
yeah.
But Get Out is fantastic.
Get Out is great and scary and funny, and again aware of the genre it's in.
Can I tell you the fun thing that I learned that you may already know?
Yeah.
Okay. This made me laugh a lot. So the guy that plays the voice on the phone, right? What is his actual name? I want to make sure I give him credit. Not that he needs it from me. Roger Jackson is the voice actor that plays the killer on the phone in the first movie. And then in all the sequels, he has reprised that role. Other credits are you aware of for Roger Jackson?
I don't think so. Or if I do, I don't remember.
Okay.
If I ever did know.
The most notable one for me personally. He's Mojo Jojo in the Powerpuff Girls.
Man, I love voice actors because they can do.
He's Mojo Jojo.
That's so funny.
It's so great.
That's really good. Now, are you picturing Mojo Jojo?
Yes.
When on the other end of that line?
I will now. Yes. It's incredible. It's incredible.
I want to see who I'm looking at.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I laughed really hard when I read that.
That's amazing.
Should we talk about next week? Because I'm going to make you watch something next week.
That's right.
And I just went to our list, and the next one, which I recently was thinking about anyway, is The Legend of Billie Jean.
Okay.
So, for those
I need to know.
For those who are unaware, we're going even further back. Legend of Billie Jean, 1985.
It's another. Go ahead.
It's Helen Slater, Christian Slater's sister, I believe. With Christian Slater. What if every movie I make you watch has Christian Slater in it?
But you never draw attention to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Pump Up the Volume is another one you'd.
Oh, I'm desperate to have us watch that, even though it's impossible to find anywhere.
Is this not a period piece?
Legend of Billie Jean? It's a very 1985 movie.
Here's a new game we should play. Heathers and Scream, too much in the cultural zeitgeist. I don't think it would have worked. Ask me what I think The Legend of Billie Jean is about.
What do you think The Legend of Billie Jean is about?
I don't know that much about it. I think it's a like Bonnie and Clyde kind of movie. I know it's from the 80s. I think it's a period piece, like maybe the 40s, maybe the 50s. I just saw the cover and I was like, she looks like a rollerblader.
Exactly. She looks
she?
like no.
Oh.
She does though, however, look. That's supposed to be a wetsuit, I think. She
Okay.
does look like she is on a roller derby team in this cover art.
Would this movie have been my queer awakening had I seen it
Most
as
likely,
a young
yes.
child? Because
Yes.
this
Yes.
cover is.
There's a very
she's got
significant
that cool-
hair. Yeah, there's this a very significant hair cutting scene in this movie.
Oh no. Uh-oh. Okay.
It is a Joan of Arc allegory.
Oh my god.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's one of the things that my best friend and I first bonded over was like our pop culture history and this movie.
I'm really excited because when you threw this movie out when we were brainstorming,
Yeah.
there was a part of me that was like not thrilled. But now all I needed to see was the cover, and I'm on board.
Yeah. It's very much in this realm of, I think of it as like a precursor to something like Pump Up the Volume or Heathers, in that it's like a teenagers fight back kind of movie.
Cool.
Like the
I like
adults
that.
suck and the teenagers have to fight back against the adults. Also, other teenagers suck, but these teenagers are fighting back against other teenagers and the adults who suck.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's Christian Slater. Like, what could be bad?
A new Christian Slater.
Yes. As even younger than he was in Heathers, obviously.
Others.
So let's tell
I'm
people where they can
excited.
watch this.
Yardley Smith.
So you can watch this on a number of places. I do believe you have to rent it. I don't think it's streaming free. It might be that, but it's only $3.99 on YouTube, Vudu, Apple TV, Amazon Prime, Redbox. It's like kind of everywhere for $4.
And we don't have a Patreon, so just pretend that we do, and that you're putting that money toward our Patreon because I want y'all to come back next week. So
Yeah, it is. How old was I? I was 12 when this movie came out, or 11 even. But it was.
I was -1.
Yeah, shut up. The log line on the cover. There's a couple of them. When you're 17, people think they can do anything to you. Billie Jean is about to prove them wrong.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, and then it also says the last thing she ever expected was to become a hero.
Yeah.
This is
It's-
something else we should be doing every week.
Yeah.
leading in.
Yeah, it's very much a sort of proto-feminist tale of a woman fighting back. It's great.
That's very cool.
I'm excited to rewatch it.
Scream's tagline was, "Don't answer the door. Don't leave the house. Don't answer the phone. But most of all, don't scream."
Good one.
Which,
It's good.
yeah. What was Heather's?
From the first blush of romance to the last squeeze of the trigger.
Oh,
I don't know if that's actually the logline or if it's something that somebody like added to this image.
huh? Hold on, there are two. It seems like that is one of them. The other two listed on IMDb are much better. Would you like to share them?
Yes. So the first one is best friends, social trends, and occasional murder.
That's great.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
The other one is just a killer comedy. Not great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Best friends, social trends, and occasional murder is very good.
It's very good. Yeah. So that's it for this week. Thank you for making me watch Scream. I did
Thank
enjoy
you for
it.
watching Scream.
I'm glad to have that sort of piece of pop culture filled in. I don't know if I'll watch the sequels. I might someday when I'm bored, but I at least have the knowledge of the first one now.
Some of them are very good.
Yeah.
I don't know that if this isn't your genre,
Yeah.
if you're not, I'm not going to push you to
mean-
watch them. Let me know if you do. Listeners, again, I don't.
It's
I
also
wouldn't
the
say I
Nev
do or
Campbell
don't.
genre, which I'm not interested in.
There you go.
So
She's so good.
Party of Five was a big show for me.
My heart had very little room for teen and or family dramas like that, except for Dawson's Creek, which matters so much to me.
Well, the parents are dead in Party of Five.
There are some dead parents in Dawson's Creek.
Yeah.
Some of them don't start out that way. And now I just cry. Now the end of the episode is just me quietly weeping.
Yeah.
Oh, we have one more thing.
What's that?
I know, listeners, I hope, let us know what you think of this, because I know we're not doing typical, like, movie recap podcasts. That's not what this is.
Mm-hmm.
I hope folks are liking it in spite or because of that fact. But if you guys hate it, let us know.
Maybe
I mean,
don't.
we'll probably,
I don't know that my ego wants to know if they hate
I mean, we'll probably keep doing it either way, but we do have a new 5-star review since last week.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so I'll share that, and then you can tell folks where to find us, and then we can send everyone on their merry way.
Can we quickly recommend a show?
Yeah.
For people who are looking for something to watch. This is not in the Yellowjackets pop culture universe, but it is fucking delightful. Citizen Jess, one of our friends on Instagram, mentioned Somebody Somewhere, which I have brought up to you in the past. I love that show so much. I love Bridget Everett. I love, what is the guy that plays her best friend? Jeff
Hiller.
Jeff Hiller. It's such a great show. So if you're looking for something else to watch, yeah,
it's a show I've been saving. I know that I will love it.
You
know
will
how
cry.
there's some things, it's like it couldn't be more up my alley. You know how there are some things where you're like, I'm saving this. I'm saving this because I know I'm gonna love it, and I just want to save it for when I need something like this.
Yeah,
that's that show for me.
It's so good. I mean, and it's short episodes, which we've talked about with The Bear. I enjoy a nice 30-minute episode. Speaking of which, I did finish The Bear, and I love that show. The second season was so good,
so incredible. I love how obsessed, especially East. I mean, like, I know everybody loves it. Everybody watches it, loves it. But there's a certain kind of person from Chicago, of course. But then also there are some like East Coasters who are whose brand, like us, is being Northeasterners who are as obsessed with it as we are. And I love that we're all just like, this is our show too.
Yeah, it is.
Like, you guys can have a Chicago, but also it's our show too.
Yeah. In the spirit of recommending shows, podcasts, etc., if you were really into The Bear and want to hear more conversation about it, I highly recommend the Prestige TV podcast breakdown of the show. Van Lathan and Charles Holmes did probably the best job I've ever heard two people do recapping a really emotional episode of television, where I was out loud being like, yes, oh my God. Like, while they were talking about it, it's very personal. It's very heartfelt. It's really, really beautiful. So highly recommend if you were really into The Bear, listening to them talk about it.
Yeah, I listened to just that episode because you recommended it. And it's wonderful.
The ones that came after were just as heartfelt and great.
If you haven't watched The Bear, go watch it so you can listen to that recap, because it was really lovely.
Yeah.
It just felt very good to be listening to. It's a way of being, it's something that I am a little shy about, is like, or not shy is not the right word, a little I don't know what the word is exactly, but of being vulnerable and open and personal without oversharing.
Yeah.
Or without making, and like having it there for a reason, to add to the conversation and to like allow for more productive analysis. And it's a master class in doing that, I think.
Totally. It's so good. It's so good. So anyway,
we have a last 5-star review.
5-star review.
This is from love the in-depth discussions. Is what their name.
Okay.
Instead of giving like an actual name, they gave another little extra review in their review, which I quite like.
Yeah.
The Watchers podcast rules. I'm so glad I found this podcast. I listen to almost all of the other Yellowjackets podcasts. These are our people.
Yeah, they are.
And this is my favorite due to the host's intelligent discussion and obvious respect for each other.
Oh,
which is so
if
nice.
only they knew. I'm kidding.
They don't hear us off mic.
We're only disrespectful when talking about like specific old school Jersey arguments that nobody cares about.
Just going to say that, Jodie.
It only has to do with Taylor ham and pork roll that nobody cares about anymore.
just going to say that exact thing.
Yeah.
Save all our disrespect for North South Jersey beef.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear you guys do a book club in the off season.
Oh no. Don't encourage Andrea.
So yeah, thank you so much. I love the reviews. I know it's a little self-indulgent, but it just...
But it makes us happy. We're just doing this because we want to. We're not getting it paid. We have no sponsors. We're just like talking about stuff we like to talk about. And if it resonates with people, that's awesome. So yeah, come back next week to listen to us talk about The Legend of Billie Jean. Watch that movie if you haven't. I would be so interested to hear other people's take on that movie.
We didn't ask folks to do this the last 2 weeks, and now I'm annoyed that we didn't. So what I'm about to say applies to Heathers and Scream as well. So if you watch the movie, shoot us an email. Let us know what you think.
Yeah, or comment on the Instagram when we post about the episode, and let us know if you'd seen the movie before, what you thought, if it was as important to you as it was to one of us, all of that stuff.
Yeah,
love to hear other people.
Yeah, and we'll share that stuff on the podcast too if anything comes up that we want to share.
Totally. Yeah, so follow us at WatchersPodNJ on Instagram and Twitter. You can follow my personal art account.
We'll probably be on Blue Sky soon too.
I know. Yeah, Twitter's
the Great Migration is happening.
Flaming
so just keep your eye out
fire.
there too.
Yeah. And you can follow my art account at Jodie_MIM on Instagram if you want to. No pressure. It's just me and my art and some memes. That's it.
And I'm at AQ Andrea Q. Mostly my dog. I do all kinds of podcast stuff. I've got some exciting new podcast stuff coming up that I'm excited to talk about in the near future. A couple of different things, actually. I'm going to be busy. And I think that's everything.
I think so.
This has been The Watchers.
Yeah, we will see you next week for Legend of Billie Jean. Bye.